Welcome to Outrageous History. I'm Ernest Granson. We're all familiar with the artists Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Vincent van Gogh, Pablo Picasso, but there's another Michelangelo who is maybe not quite so well known, but whose paintings in the late 1500s and early 1600s startled the church-going public. That's where most of his works were placed. They enraged some of his fellow artists, but also influenced generations of artists to follow. That artist was known as Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, and during his time, he became the most famous painter in Italy. His paintings were a dramatic departure in realism and technique from other artists before him. His short life was no less dramatic. In fact, journalist and author Andrew Graham-Dixon, who explored the artist's life in his biography, Caravaggio, A Life Sacred and Profane, says that much of what is known about him has been discovered in the criminal archives of his time. Andrew is with us today. Andrew, thanks very much for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Now, Andrew, I don't suppose you can separate Caravaggio from his paintings. In fact, you wrote, whatever he set out to paint, the death of a martyr, the infancy of Christ, or his resurrection, he always wound up painting himself. So what did you mean by that, and what led you to undertake this search across Italy?
I think what I meant by that is that in Caravaggio, one of the things I think that has continued to touch people over the centuries about his work is that he is so deeply immersed in the act of creating a picture that no matter how commissioned that painting is, no matter how much the limits have been set on the subject by the church, Caravaggio's own force of personality is so strong. I mean, in this sense, he is, to a certain extent, like his namesake Michelangelo, who also could never be anything but himself, could never be anything but extremely original. So that Caravaggio paints his own sense of empathy with the subject so strongly that in almost every case with his great masterpieces, what you get in a sense is two pictures. You get an extraordinarily brilliant interpretation of a piece of biblical story in all its humanity, but you also get at the same time a profound sense of where Caravaggio is himself on his journey through life. And a great example of that would be, there are two paintings of the Supper at Emmaus. One is in the National Gallery and the other is in the Brera Gallery in Milan. And the painting in the National Gallery was painted around 1600 at the height, at the zenith of his career, which was meteor-like. And it's full of hope. It's full of a sense of these disciples actually seeing Christ, actually seeing the resurrected Christ, seeing the hope of eternal life, seeing all that lit in this amazing proto-cinematic light scheme that Caravaggio devised for the painting. And then you look at the later picture, which is painted in 1606, just after Caravaggio has more or less wrecked his entire chance of becoming one of the great Roman painters in papal Rome by murdering a man in a duel. And he's been sentenced to death, a horrible death. And the head of the papal justice system has even stated in the sentence, if you can't bring me his body, bring me his head. It's a capital sentence, caput meaning head in Latin. And he paints this second version of the same subject. And it's as if somebody has turned the lights out. It's as if, yes, they go through the motions of seeing Christ, but everything is dark. It's as if Caravaggio himself cannot see salvation anymore for himself. And he cannot help but project that onto the figures in his paintings. It's not, I'm saying, deliberate, but it's there.
Well, you examine his early history and try to explain how some of that so greatly influenced that painting technique and the concept. Back in his early days, you place a lot of emphasis on Carlo Borromeo, who was the Archbishop of Milan, where Caravaggio spent some significant early years. Now, what kind of influence did Borromeo have on the artists and on that part of Italy?
But it's a complicated question to answer. I don't want to answer it in such a long-winded way because we'd use up all our time. But to put the matter, as it were, in as simple but without dumbing it down a way as I can think of, you might divide the church at this moment, which is a crucial moment for the Catholic Church. It's the Counter-Reformation. The church has been subject to all these challenges from the Protestant North and is now attempting to re-establish its authority over particularly the hearts and minds of the Italian people. And there's an argument within the church as to how you do this. And the right wing, as it were, those who very much are bound up with the idea of reaffirming the authority of the church, they say that the way to do this is by painting very grand pictures, pictures that will overawe the audience, pictures that will make people realize how much greater than they were the apostles. So robe the apostles as if they were Roman senators, make them look splendid, make the Queen of Heaven, the Virgin, look as if she's a queen, dress her in beautiful drapery and silk and so on. And on the other side, as in the church today, there's the left, which is essentially and most beautifully embodied, if you like, by the Franciscan movement and those who cleave to the old ideals of St. Francis. And they say, no, you don't do that. What you do is you get the people to come with you by reminding them that the apostles were poor, just like they're poor. So paint them with dirty feet, paint them with ripped robes, paint them as simple, ordinary people, like our congregations, and then they will come back to the church. And Borromeo was on that side. Very much on that side. He went round the city himself in sackcloth and had himself covered in ashes at the time of the plague that struck Milan, the plague that killed most of Caravaggio's family. He preached penitence. And he also, and this is what I think is really interesting about Caravaggio's work, is that Borromeo implicitly suggested, and friends of his within the church wrote explicitly, that we should abandon the glories of high Renaissance art. We should turn our back on what Michelangelo and Raphael did with all their grandeur and their magnificence. And we should go back to the much simpler forms of art that preceded them, that appealed to naked piety. And he was really interested in forms of figurative sculpture that look almost to our eyes now like folk art. And some of them survive as folk art, images made out of straw and hay that you'll find in some of the pilgrimage sites of northern Italy, but elsewhere they survive in a higher form as these sort of mise en scène made in wooden sculpture, where everything is really raw and vital and immediate. And I think that Caravaggio, although he's a great innovator in art, he's also, in my mind, the first primitivist, in the sense that he is going back behind Michelangelo and Raphael's back. He's going back to those earlier forms of popular art. And yes, he's phrasing them within this new pictorial idiom of cinematic lighting and so on. But if you think about how Caravaggio composes a painting, it's as if, to me, he's always first of all thinking, how would one of those devisers of wooden sculptural ensembles, how would he have done it? And to me, Caravaggio's paintings are, as it were, almost always imaginary depictions of sculpture. He's a very, very sculptural artist. They're not photographic in their realism, which they're often said to be. He wants to put you among this group of people, and he wants them to seem as real to you. They're life-size in his mind, and you should become part of the group, which is exactly the ambition behind those older sculptors who literally created these kind of theaters of wooden figures mourning the death of Christ after his crucifixion. So it's complicated, but I think that's what he got from Borromeo, this idea that you should look behind, you should look back, you shouldn't be ashamed of going back to the old piety of St. Francis, which had invigorated Italian art with all this idea about vital, raw, poor realism back in the 1200s and the 1300s. That's where Caravaggio is going back, but he's bringing to the project this amazing new use of light and paint, because of course he's a painter, not a sculptor.
Now, what he was able to thrust that upon the public, and he became well known for it. But he also made his life really difficult simply by his actions and his attitudes. What was going on when he moved from different locations, and especially when he went into Rome and started getting into trouble with the law?
Well, to a certain extent, these things go hand in hand, because as it happens, during Caravaggio's career, not only is he reinvigorating this old Franciscan poor idea of how to bring the poor into the church, but he's doing it at a time when actually that wing of the church is losing the fight. So Caravaggio is this master of, as I said, poor realism, bringing the poor into the church, just at a time when the rich and the powerful within the church are gaining the upper hand, and they're saying, well, hang on a minute, do we want the poor thinking that this place is just theirs? Maybe we want something else. Maybe we want the Baroque. Maybe we want a vast church with huge paintings that make the people feel really small so that they obey us, they obey our authority. So the period of Caravaggio's greatest trouble and strife in his life in Rome coincides with that moment. And at that moment, he is painting a series of pictures. He paints 3 in a row at one point, which are all rejected. They go up onto the altar and they are taken back. They are sent back to him. And the message is always the same. Basically, the Madonna looks too much like a woman of the streets. You haven't painted the prophets and the apostles with enough gravitas and dignity. You've put holes in their clothes. You've got dirt under their fingernails. We can't accept this. And that coincides with Caravaggio having enemies among the other artists of Rome who are jealous of his great success. And in any case, he comes from this culture, which is one of the 3 subjects of my book. It's Caravaggio's life, Caravaggio's art, and Caravaggio's world. He comes from this world, which is, very hard for perhaps modern people to understand, or perhaps not so hard, because it's in some ways its codes are very close to the codes that you find among, say, the gangs of Chicago today. That it's all about honor. It's a law underneath the law. So Caravaggio runs with these guys, and they all support his people all support the French cardinal, whereas his big enemy, they all support the Spanish cardinal. So they're opposed at that level, but they're also opposed at the level that they hate each other's guts. And if you insult somebody, you insult their face. And so if you insult Caravaggio's face, he's going to take that literally, and he's going to cut your face. If you insult his reputation, he might go and smash all the windows of your house. And it seems like to a lot of people, and it has seemed throughout history, like this is just, he's a madman, he's a weirdo, he's an outsider. But actually, Bernini did the same thing. There were other artists doing the same thing. And the more I delved into the culture, the more I realized this is actually happening a lot. There are specific sentences within judicial law in Rome for the sin of, for example, rubbing excrement on somebody's door, which is what you do when they badmouth you, because the door is the mouth of the house. So they have badmouthed you, and you pick up some horse dung and you rub it on their door. And it's a mark of what you think of them having insulted you. And Caravaggio is not the only person. He's very extreme, which is another question. And I think that goes back, in my own opinion, if you were to go into a psychiatrist's today, he would be diagnosed as bipolar, and probably bipolar due to post-traumatic stress syndrome, because he had suffered the most appalling things when he was young. He lost his entire male family in about 3 days to the plague in Milan when he was 5 years old. Who gets over that?
Well, take us through a bit of that timeline then, from his childhood, until the latter part of his life.
Well, it's very difficult to take you through the timeline for the very early part, because you have a life. you have to remember, it's the 1600s, it's the 1590s, this is 1580s. This is a time before the biographer can work with letters. People aren't writing letters to each other, not at Caravaggio's level. They might be at the papal level and so on, and at the humanist level, but at ordinary artist level, they aren't. So what you're going on is death records, burial records, christening records, and above all, criminal records. And in Caravaggio's case, but it's almost as if you only know him through his criminal records and his paintings, which are, of course, the opposite of his criminal records. But what, as far as we can tell, is that he was apprenticed to an artist in Milan. He was, so to speak, the idle apprentice, because there's no indication whatsoever that he kind of completed that apprenticeship. The guy to whom he was apprenticed specialized in frescoes. Caravaggio was once offered a fortune to paint some frescoes, and he said, I haven't got the faintest idea how to do it. So it's my strong supposition that he never completed that apprenticeship. There's the mangled copy of a very early sort of pencil portrait of him written by someone who met him in Rome in the early 1600s. And in that mangled sort of manuscript, there seems to be a reference to a prostitute injured, a policeman murdered, Caravaggio spending a year in jail. This is in about 1594, maybe, when he's 18 years old, and then he goes to Rome. And when he arrives in Rome, he has few skills as a painter, which is also why I think he probably didn't complete his apprenticeship. His early work is far, far, far inferior in level to his later work. He climbs his way up the tree very slowly with lots of fights along the way. And then suddenly he's this great painter. He gets taken under the wing of a cardinal because he becomes friends with a very clever picture dealer who lives opposite the cardinal's house. And they put a painting by Caravaggio in the window of the shop, and the cardinal sees it, takes Caravaggio under his wing, begins to give him opportunities, works his way up. And before you know it, he's got the commission to paint the Chirazi Chapel, and he's got the commission to paint the Church of the French, and he's painting these astonishing, huge altarpieces that are absolutely knocking everybody's socks off. And then the trouble begins, because he's a difficult man. He's a very proud man. There are a lot of other very difficult and proud artists in Rome. They do him wrong, he does them wrong. He writes pornographic poetry about a man who paints a picture that accuses him in pictorial form of being a sodomite, a homosexual, accuses him of being someone who has sex with his apprentice. Whether he did or didn't, we don't know, but Caravaggio certainly took umbrage at it. The other guy then has him thrown in jail. He's interrogated for 3 months. He's about to be sent to the galleys, but then his cardinal manages to get him off. He goes back to painting, but still the fights and the arguments continue. And eventually he murders in a sword fight the man who's a very nasty piece of work, a man called Ranuccio Tomasoni, who also happens to be the pimp of Caravaggio's main model, female model, a lady called Phila de Melandroni, who is not only a very, as it were, high-class prostitute. She graduates up from being a prostitute to being a courtesan, the kept woman of a noble family, originally from Florence. So she has a nice palace in Rome and so on. But it's quite possibly on behalf of her that Caravaggio ends up killing Ranuccio Tomasoni, from which point, in one sense, his life never recovers from that. But in another sense, he goes on the run. He runs away to Naples, he runs away to Sicily. He happens to run away to the Deep South. And in the Deep South, unlike in Rome, they still very much cleave to these pauperist ideas that lie at the heart of his way of painting, these ideas that you paint, the story of Christ, but you paint it for the poor. Well, so yes, he's on the run, but he's run to a place where he's very, very much, and the people there, they can hardly believe it. The people, when he goes to Malta, he ends up on the island of Malta. They can't hardly believe, one of the most famous painters in Italy has come to their barren provincial outpost. And wow, he's going to paint pictures for us. Fantastic. So his art thrives and his life shrinks.
That the episode in Malta is quite amazing, where he becomes a member of the Order of the St. John's Knights, and then what has followed him all through his life. He gets into trouble, gets in prison, and then escapes. That's almost hard to believe.
It's like, when I was working on my book, I was doing an interview with Martin Scorsese at the same time, and I just finished my book. And I said, look, Martin, you've got, just please read this book, because you should make a movie. If I'd been 20 years early, maybe he would have, because it's the one thing he hasn't, really done is a not, fantastic historical drama. But I mean, it is a movie. It's just a movie, and the book can't help but be written like a movie at that point. The story is amazing, and the fact that we have the information that we do about the story, which is down to some friends of mine, some great art historians and archival historians, both in Malta and in Naples. I mean, the work that they've done to find these documents is just incredible. The things that they found that I was able to take advantage of that hadn't, up until 2010 when my book came out. I mean, they really hadn't made it, as it were, to the front page of art history. They were there in little notes and footnotes in highly academic journals. My friend who'd actually discovered the death, who killed Caravaggio, he discovered the guy's identity. He actually put that in a footnote of an article written for the Maltese Art Historian Association. So, but it's an amazing story. I don't know if I've got room to tell it to you here, but it's just, you couldn't make it up.
So what eventually led to his demise? There were some questions about it. I mean, he was on the run, and yet he was able to have some serious commissions, as you just mentioned. But why did he die? I think he was only 38 years old when at the time of his death.
Well, I mean, basically, to cut a long story short, I don't want to put people off reading my books. I shouldn't really tell you the ending, but to cut a long story short, what happened was Caravaggio throughout his life had been protected and supported by a lady called Marchesa Colonna. She's a member of one of the most powerful families in all of Italy, and nobody could figure out why for years. And then he's now no longer with us, but a great art historian in Italy discovered the connection. And the connection is, and I think this is highly plausible, that Caravaggio's aunt, who was a wet nurse, served as wet nurse to Costanza Colonna. And Costanza Colonna was married when she was 13 and apparently tried to commit suicide several times, had a number of children, because she just found the whole thing of being married at 13 and having children at 14 and 16 and so on into this great Italian family. It was just too much. And it seems to me that Caravaggio's aunt, who was the wet nurse, who helped her and who suckled her children for her, must have saved her life. There's no other connection that I can see that would explain why Costanza Colonna protects Caravaggio throughout his life and never wants a painting. She's the only great patron who never wants a painting from him. And she gave a house to his aunt as well. So when he kills the guy in Rome, where does Caravaggio go? He goes to Costanza Colonna's house, the Palazzo Colonna, one of the greatest palaces in Rome. He's sent out on a carriage. Where? Zagarola. It's a Colonna estate outside Rome. He's safe from the law. That's where he paints the Supper at Emmaus. Where does he go next? Naples. Where does he stay? Caia, the Palazzo Caia, which is the Colonna Palace in Caia. What's the connection with Malta? Costanza Colonna's son, who's the same age as Caravaggio, also did a terrible thing, killed a guy. The Pope said, I will execute him. She begged the Pope not to execute him. The Pope said, okay, send him to Malta. Let him join the Knights of Malta. Let him fight for the Christian cause. And if he shows he's worthy, I'll pardon him. He fought. He succeeded. He became admiral of the fleet of Malta. Her son. Amazing discovery in the documents. A description of this guy, her son, admiral of the Knights of Malta, arriving in Naples to see his mother on the same day that Caravaggio leaves to go to Malta. So, what's happened here? Costanza Colonna must have said, right, you, Caravaggio, look at my son. He was the same. He killed a guy. He got over it. He's an admiral. You, my son, take him. He's a difficult bastard. Take him to Malta. They'll make men of him there. So he went to Malta. He paints pictures. They long to have a great artist in Malta. They've got, after the siege of Malta, money has flooded into Malta, into Valletta. They've got a new city. They've got these great oratories and churches, and they've got no art because no artist will go there. So Caravaggio's there. It's perfect. paints a huge picture of the beheading of St. John, one of the great masterpieces of his life. He's about to be invested as a Knight of Malta. And if you're invested as a Knight of Malta, you are suddenly so high up the chain in the Catholic world that all, any accusations that you murdered a guy, everything's dropped. He could go back to Rome with his head held high, not even as a criminal who's been forgiven. He'll go back as a Knight of Malta. He's saved. And what happens? The day before the painting is going to be unveiled, on the feast day of St. John, Caravaggio goes into the house of another Knight of Malta, higher up the chain of the knights than he is, gets into a fight, no doubt because the other guy said, well, you're not a real Knight of Malta. You didn't fight any battles, did you? You've just been made an honorary. Had a fight, he shoots this guy with a gun in the groin. It's not the first time he's attacked Ranuccio Tomasoni in the groin. Maybe there's some kind of sexual, because a wound is usually meaningful in Caravaggio. If he attacks your face, it's because of the reputation, and so on and so on. If he hits you on the back of the head, it's because you talked about him behind his back, and so on and so on. So if he attacks you in the groin, maybe I don't know, did the guy try and have sex with Caravaggio? Who knows what happened? But something bad happened. And the most reliable biographer of Caravaggio, who, by a wonderful irony of history, is his greatest enemy, Giovanni Baglioni. But if you read Baglioni's life of Caravaggio, it is so unbelievably true. So even things that we didn't know that were true have been backed up by archival finds. Baglioni is always right. So Baglioni says to us, and I believe it, there is no absolute evidence to suggest it. Baglioni says that Caravaggio was put in prison in Malta. He somehow managed to escape, climbed up, he climbed out of a well using grappling ropes because he'd been imprisoned in a well. I've actually been in the well. It still exists. It's got people's death notes written in graffiti on the wall because you go there and when you come out, come out to die. He got out. He had help. Grappling hooks, ropes. He climbs over the wall. He then climbs down a 300-foot precipice, dives into the Bay of Malta, where he swims round the different patrolling boats to another bay that's 3 miles away, where he's met by a boat, which then takes him to Sicily. He's in Sicily for like a year, 2 years. Then he goes back to Naples. And at that point, we let Baglioni take up the story. Baglioni tells us that, well, if you put it together with a bit of archive, basically what happened was that he paints one last picture in Naples. He then goes to a bar, a tavern, a place known for its polymorphous perversity. So he was probably up to no good in ethical terms. And when he comes out, he's got 4 guys waiting for him. And 3 of them hold him down, and the other one cuts his face off. They say. Well, certainly, that's maybe an exaggeration because there are 1 or 2. He survives the attack. We hear nothing from him at all for 8 months. It's the only period of his life for which there's nothing for 8 months. And then he's trying to get back to Rome. And there's his last boat trip. But in my opinion, he dies of the wounds. The boat trip goes wrong. It's all in my book. But it took me a long time to put it together. But and I felt a bit like a kind of weird cross between an art historian and a detective. And it's a tragic story. But that's what happened to him. And I believe Baglioni. I think it was the man he'd insulted. You don't want to get on the wrong side of a Knight of Malta. I mean, these are the people who withstood the attack by a Turkish fleet that outnumbered them by 5,000 to 1 or something crazy, and they still survived. So these people are hard men. So if you shoot one of them in the groin and then you escape from prison and escape justice, you haven't necessarily escaped. And when he was on Sicily, we know from Sicilians who wrote about him, guess what? He's bought a dog. He's got a black dog. It's called Corvo. And he sleeps with his sword under his pillow, and he doesn't stay anywhere long. So he kind of knows he's a hunted man. I mean, in modern parlance, I guess he thought he was a dead man walking.
And that's how he lived his whole life. Now, I usually ask the final question about the legacy, because that's what these types of characters are with all of the people that I examined. So what do you feel has been his legacy? Because he has had a bit of a revival through the centuries.
Yeah, I mean, the extraordinary thing about Caravaggio's legacy is, I mean, it used to be said, and it has often been said, and I think it's wrong, that Caravaggio was kind of forgotten about until the 1950s when an Italian art historian called Roberto Longhi took a great interest in him. And more to the point, Pier Paolo Pasolini, the filmmaker, took a great interest in him and started using Caravaggesque light effects in cinema and started embracing Caravaggio's use of full face emotion and gesture and so on. But that's true to a point. And his legacy, I mean, I did this interview with Martin Scorsese, which was only about Caravaggio. It was an interview about Caravaggio because Scorsese himself is so obsessed by Caravaggio that he openly said to me, you know, every single scene in Taxi Driver, every single scene in Mean Streets, you know, Paul Schrader and I, Paul Schrader, the scriptwriter, we were going to see the Caravaggios in the New York galleries. That's what we were thinking about. We were thinking about lighting. How would he light it? How would he tell the story? So as a storyteller and as a if you like, a lighting director, his influence has been enormous. But the idea that he was never influenced, you know, for a long time he went into the shadows, I don't believe that for a minute, because that's the amazing thing about him, is as far as academic theory and as far as writing about art went, Caravaggio was the one you should not mention. You know, Poussin said Caravaggio was sent into the world to destroy painting. He was taught never to look at Caravaggio. But on the other hand, artists couldn't help looking at Caravaggio. And the very fact that so many of Caravaggio's paintings are in the French district of Rome. They're in the area known as the area of the French. He lived in the house of the Medici cardinal, and the Medici supported France in all its politics. So there were all these French churches there, and Caravaggio painted for them. So for centuries, all the French artists who went to Rome, guess where they always stay? They stay in the French Quarter. So think of Jacques-Louis David, think of Jericho, think of the Rafters of the Medusa. What is that but a huge tribute to the power of Caravaggesque chiaroscuro? Think of Georges de la Tour. And, you know, there's a massive, massive influence. And the other place where his influence has been huge is because of painting in Naples, which was, of course, Spanish. It wasn't part of Italy. It was part of Spain. The whole of Spanish painting, if you think of Ribera, if you think of Velázquez, it's hugely influenced by Caravaggio. And finally, Rembrandt. Where does Rembrandt come out of, if not Caravaggio? And we know that Rembrandt was fascinated and obsessed by Caravaggio. You know, look at that amazing picture of what's the painting? It's Lucretia or Bathsheba. If you look at that picture by Rembrandt and then look at Caravaggio's David and Goliath, it's the same composition. It's the same painting. And Picasso said, you know, to Salvador Dali when he was painting Guernica, Picasso said, oh, if only I could paint a horse. This horse is really bugging me. If only I could paint a horse that smells like a horse. I want to paint a horse as good as Caravaggio's horse in the Chirazi Chapel. So throughout the centuries, yeah, sure, he was forgotten by those who write the history of art. But what about people who look, artists? He was never forgotten by them. Never for 1 second was he forgotten by them because of the sheer power of what he did. So you can look at any century, and I can point to, you know, 17th century, I can point to Ribera, who's quite a big artist. Velázquez is a pretty big artist. You know, Rembrandt, people have heard of him. You know, you can go through the centuries, 18th century David, 19th century Jericho, 20th century Picasso, and all of early cinema up to and including Scorsese. I mean, the influence is huge.
Well, his life and his paintings are just an incredible story. And Andrew, we thank you so much for taking us through this strange but captivating world of the artist Caravaggio. And I thank all of you for tuning in to Outrageous History. I'm Ernest Granson. We'll see you again soon.
Outrageous History is produced by Northern Flicker Media.